Hey everybody. So here I am with Scott Valentine. How you doing, Scott?
Great. And yourself?
Good, very good. Going over
All right.
some blending modes in Photoshop today. Right, Scott?
That's absolutely right. We're going to look specifically at how you can use some of the different characteristics of blend modes to help with retouching. And we'll do it from kind of a philosophical background.
Great. Excellent. So let's see some comments coming already. Let's see. Hi, gang from the UK. So as a reminder, so please give StreamYard permission to show your name and profile pics so that I'll be able to credit you when you comment or ask questions. You should see that just under the live video where it says streamyard.com/Facebook. Just click on that and give permissions. And let's see, anybody else? So let us know where you are watching from. There we go. Hi from rainy Southeast Alaska. Nikki, welcome, Nikki.
Southeast Alaska. Wow.
I think New York is very being hit with rainstorms now. Yeah.
Yeah, they're getting inundated. That's a tough one. You've seen some of the flooding that's happening?
Yeah, exactly. I saw a video. It was quite. So Warren from Los Angeles, same as where I am. Oh, good. We've got Dominic, who's in Kenya, the home of nature. Yes. And
welcome, Dominic.
Yeah. And someone from Nottingham, the UK.
Excellent.
Quite the international crowd here.
All right.
Steven's here from Arizona. How you doing, Steven? I think I've been seeing him on was it Clubhouse as well, or just in the groups a lot lately. Good to see you here. And while people are joining, let me just remind everyone, let's see, that this is all possible for StreamYard. StreamYard is the one that makes this all possible, multi-streaming to various social networks. So I have a little intro video about StreamYard for your viewing pleasure now. Thanks, StreamYard. Yep. Excellent platform. Okay. So about one more minute, and then I'll have Scott introduce himself. Let's see, more people coming in. So Steven says, a lot of us has gone back to our real lives and are not on social media as much. I hear you. Yeah, I used to run like a Wednesday room on Clubhouse and pretty much had to kind of give that up to get back more into my freelance work. So it's also hard to jumble the Facebook groups with also doing Clubhouse. So. Okay, someone says hello.
Well, howdy, random stranger.
Facebook user. So yeah, so once again, please give StreamYard permission to show your name and profile pic so I'll be able to credit you when you comment or ask questions. That's the link underneath the live video, streamyard.com/Facebook. Okay, so that's about a good amount of time. Let's see, one more. Andrew Nichols from the UK. Good to see you here. He's very dedicated. Thank you. All right, so Scott, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a bit about today's session?
Sure. So I have been dabbling with Photoshop since probably the late 90s. I actually started in it by accident. I took a job as a web developer doing Flash animation because there weren't many of us doing programmatic-based Flash where you're actually doing it by code rather than keyframing. And the day that I started at a web development company in a new job, the graphic designer quit. And so the boss came over and said, hey, you're it. Go learn Photoshop. Literally the first day on the job. So I started taking some night classes, and I realized pretty quickly that a lot of Photoshop made sense to me. And I wanted to understand, I wanted to be able to take that understanding and help other people learn why Photoshop behaves the way it does in some cases. I'll jump to the end and then disclose that sometimes it behaves a certain way because somebody else doesn't know how you use Photoshop, or that's just the way it's always been done. So if you run into something that doesn't really make sense, and you beat your head against the wall, don't pass out, because sometimes things just don't make sense. Anyway, after I was in that role for a little while, I started getting involved in the broader Photoshop community in a group called Photoshop Techniques. And the central focus of that group was to troubleshoot and reverse engineer. So we had two components. Photoshop's not behaving the way I expect. Let's figure it out. Or there's this really cool effect that I saw. How would I do it? Or how can I achieve this vision that I have? And that gave me a lot of tactical experience in trying to understand how people use the application, what they want to get out of it. And I started seeing a lot of commonality in the tools behind the scenes. So I became a user group manager after that and started writing articles and books. And I picked up some odd jobs, not only teaching Photoshop, but also just going ahead with graphic design and photo retouching. Picked up some photography skills along the way. My background really, though, is science. I have a degree in physics, and I specialize in material science. So part of my approach by nature is to take things apart to the most fundamental levels and try to put them back together and see if there's anything new that we can learn from it or come up with some new combination of stuff. And I think it's really important that you understand the fundamental nature of some of your tools so that you can expand beyond them, because ultimately you don't want your tools to get in the way of your art. You want your art to be your own expression, whether it's commercial retouching or digital fine art, some composite blend, multimedia, whatever. You have to understand the nature of your tools. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today, focusing on how blend modes in particular work and how you can apply them to some common retouching tasks. So with that, we can go ahead and jump into my screen here.
Great. Looks good.
So one of the things that I like to get people to try out on their own is to build test files that you can experiment with. This is a basic color chart. You can ignore the layer stack for now. We'll just pretend it's all flat. So I'll group that together. This basically represents the RGB spectrum. It goes through the display colors for RGB and CMYK, not the print versions. And it also has a range of saturations from fully saturated and full brightness to white all the way out to black. The reason this is fun is because then you can go back and take, say, a solid color over the top of it. Doesn't matter what. We'll just choose this for now. Come on. And change the blend mode. So one experiment you can do is just simply to create a color spectrum and walk down each of these blend modes just to see how they behave. You'll notice here darker color is kind of interesting because it doesn't look like it's actually blending anything. And this is one of the modes that actually just makes a decision. So it compares all the information on a lower layer with the information on the current layer, and it makes a decision as to what to display. In this case, darker color compared with this magenta, you can see that these gray steps all show through. So they must be darker. Photoshop must think it's darker than this magenta color. Same thing happens in the spectrum over here and in these color ramps. So how do we use that information? Well, we can start to see that instead of doing math on everything, these are simple comparisons, and we can go back and look at the channels, which actually make up RGB colors. So we'll start with red, and we'll look at green, and there's almost nothing contributing in the green areas. It's completely blocked, and blue. Blend modes work in one of two major ways. They either look at individual channels and do some math comparing the layers together, or they can composite all the layers together to come up with something, in this case, a brightness value. So darker color composites all of these channels to decide which one's darker or lighter. And I don't want to get into the math today, but the secret sauce here is that Photoshop does math all the time to determine what to display. And sometimes that math doesn't make sense, like I referred to earlier. You don't have to know any of this to actually use the blend modes, but it helps to keep in mind that if you're not getting something you expect, go check out the channels and see if you can figure out if something is behaving in a composite way or in a channel by channel basis to give you basic results. So these little experiments give you insight. So let's check out some of these others. Overlay. Everybody knows overlay or most people use overlay for increasing contrast. And we look at soft light as also increasing contrast, just not to the same degree. Some of these others don't make sense with solid colors. Hard mix, that's a weird one for a lot of folks. Difference. So you can see here that just playing with the different blend modes gives you an opportunity to explore how they work and how you might want to use them in the future, right?
And just to let people know, what is the keyboard shortcut that you use to cycle through the blend modes?
You know, I wrote a whole book on blend modes and I never use the keyboard shortcut, so I'll let you tell them that, because I have a bad habit of just going through like this.
Right. So just so people know, I believe that's Shift plus. So Shift key and the plus key, as long as you have chosen your move tool, then it should cycle through the layer blending modes. Yep.
So, and that's actually a really good point. In the real world, not everybody uses the application the way the engineers think you should. And not everybody uses all the cool stuff, right? So people who can be complete Photoshop wizards may do things in a way that you consider very difficult or not efficient, but it's what we've learned over time. And everybody falls into that. So that's a good question.
And Warren just reminds us that also if you do Shift minus, then you can go back up. So Shift plus cycles through, Shift minus goes back.
Yep, exactly. So why do you want to do this stuff besides just looking at the results? One of the key reasons is if you go to, say, an image that you like and you throw on let's just do a basic gradient over the top of this. I'll hit G. I'm just going to drag a gradient. It doesn't matter what. So I'm going to go through and I want to add some color to this, and I try different blend modes. Okay, that's cool. What I'm going to start doing almost immediately is falling into this trap of, well, I like overlay and soft light. And every time I go to apply a gradient to an image, I'm going to choose one of these two. And so you ignore some of these other things. You get these blends like hard mix. You say, well, in this case, I kind of like it. But generally, you'll look at your own image and you have an emotional investment in it. And when you try out these blend modes, you may reject things out of hand just because you don't like them. And that's kind of a disservice, because then you miss out on opportunities, say like this. If you know that hard mix always compresses colors to one of the 6 standards full saturation spectrum colors or black and white, you may ignore it. But just tinkering around, you can come up with some really cool different effects that you may not have imagined at first. And that's the value of experimenting and exploration. So the advice there is build some experiment files that kind of look like this, or have color ramps, gradients, anything that you want that abstracts the canvas from your own artwork so that you can explore the tools. And this goes for more than just blend modes. Anything you want to try out, grab some random images that you don't have an emotional investment in and just explore. So let's try.
Yep.
Next.
That's how I learned in the beginning too, was, keep trying every single thing in Photoshop and use images that you don't have any attachment to, so you can be more daring about it, So.
Right. I do want to give you a little caveat here. This one's actually kind of cool. The gradient tool that I just used, right? I have a special spectrum gradient that goes all the way from red back around to red, and it passes through all the stuff. The default gradients that you get with Photoshop, like this black and white, start off with this smoothness value at 100. So let me take a little diversion and show you why you want to adjust this to 0 if you're going to use gradients in a technical way, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So I'm going to leave it at the default setting of 100, and I'm just going to make this I'm going to drag from top to bottom, right? And I'm going to add some guides. So we want 4 evenly spaced guides. Okay. Now, this looks like a standard gradient, and you'd expect it to be even across the entire surface. But if I come down here, and this is the first time we're going to use an adjustment layer today, I'm going to use Posterize, and it has 4 levels. So that divides the entire brightness value on the canvas into whatever level this slider is set at. And you can see that the middle gray values are kind of compressed. They're not in there. They're not right up to the guidelines. And that's because the smoothness value is trying to do something to correct for human perception and vision. You don't have to worry about that too much right now, but just get this idea down. We can sort of correct this by adding a curves adjustment. And oops, let me clip it here. So okay, there we go. Adding a curves adjustment and fooling around. Oops, I hit 2 buttons at the same time. Fooling around until we expand and balance out these tones, these values. And as you can see, it's not exactly trivial. And it takes a little bit of work, but we can eventually get there. Right, and so this is reasonably good. So this is the original gradient, and this is the corrected one. However, if we simply go in and create another blank layer here, we'll turn these off, go into our gradient and hit smooth down to 0, do the same thing, and because Posterize is on, you'll see it immediately. It's automatically balanced. So this becomes interesting when you're trying to do gradient maps for retouching, where you want to correct skin tones and you want to make sure that the values are evenly distributed, or basically anything where you want to use a gradient in a correction kind of manner. It helps to take the smoothness value down to 0 so that you actually have a linear gradient as opposed to this, this kind of squished in the middle. You can imagine what's happening here is that your midtones are getting crunched together a little bit, and you might be losing a little bit of fidelity. Okay, so where do we want to go next? Are there any questions on why this happens this way or what this means to blend modes?
No questions so far, but Thomas Benner, who we know from the Adobe world, says, I hope you have time to blend textures as well.
Oh, you know what? I can probably fit that in. I hadn't actually thought about doing that just yet because I was looking more at image correction. But yeah, that's a great idea. I think I can dig some stuff up pretty quickly. All right.
Great.
So let's look at this color here. All right, so I have another spectrum. It's the same one that you just saw in the gradient dialog. And I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer to it. So this is the first lesson about blending modes, is that you don't actually have to have a real image on this layer above whatever you're going to affect. Adjustment layers can also take blend modes. So that gives you a little bit of freedom because you don't have to duplicate a layer in order to get something called a self blend. When you apply a blend mode to an adjustment layer above a regular image layer, it behaves the same way as if you duplicated the layer and then changed the blend mode. So this way, not only do you get the advantage of a self blend, but you also get the power of whatever that adjustment layer is you're using. So you can see as I cycle through here, these are the effects if I had duplicated that spectral gradient and put it on top to change the blend modes. All right. So it's not very exciting yet. Let's look at hard mix. The next thing that I want to comment on is when you go to blend layers that have blend modes on them, typically opacity will let you take whatever's on the top layer and sort of merge it with the bottom layer. And this is kind of expected behavior. Whatever layer is getting the opacity adjustment just becomes less visible. But the math that I mentioned earlier kicks in a little bit here when you talk about adjustment, or when you talk about fill. So if I lower the fill, what's actually happening here is that the blend is occurring, I'm sorry, the layers are being merged together before the blend is applied. And so there's an order of operations thing here. There are actually 8 blend modes that behave like this, and you can find that information online constantly, so don't worry about remembering it right now. But the important part is the philosophical element, right? Here I have fill at, let's just put it in at 50%. And you can see this behaves more like you'd expect when you kind of merge mathematical functions, right? There's a smooth transition between, say, this cyan and blue. Doing this with opacity at 50%, it just smears everything, and what you're seeing is more of the bottom layer without anything actually being blended to it. You're just making the top layer less visible. All right, and we can apply that immediately. This is the result of an experiment. We can apply that immediately to something like this. So here's an image with not only a strong color cast, but it's pretty hazy. There's low contrast. We can attack that pretty quickly by adding a curves adjustment layer. And instead of futzing around trying to get everything looking nice with the curve itself, we'll just skip ahead to linear light, which you can see has an awful lot of contrast, right? That's really, really crunchy. If we tried to back that off with opacity, it's okay. It just still kind of looks muddy, and there's no real good rocking point. There's no balance in that preserves these highlights and the shadows very nicely. However, if we go to fill, linear light happens to be one of those special 8 that behaves differently. So now we can adjust the contrast to get rid of that haze. There we go. About 40% looks good. And because we're using an adjustment layer, we can tackle that blue shift by going to the blue channel in the drop-down menu. And instead of having to use multiple layers, now we've got one layer doing double duty with a blend mode. So there's the before and after with just one adjustment layer. So that saves you some time. And it's unfortunately not something that you would come to intuitively. There's nothing in the Photoshop help files that would tell you, oh gosh, I want to increase contrast, so I'm going to do this multiple move on a single layer. These are things that you come to when you experiment. All right. Now let's apply another blend mode here, and I've removed the blue color correction. And I'm going to show you another little trick that is probably one of the first ones that made me realize blend modes could be used more than just for creative effects. So let's pretend you didn't want to mess with this curve right here. And you got your contrast, but this applies to just about any image that has a strong color cast to it. We're going to stamp merge visible. This is Command Shift Option E or Control Shift Alt E on PC to stamp a copy of everything that was visible on the image before or on the canvas before. So it still has its color cast. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Average. And average takes whatever the dominant color cast is in the image, whatever occurs most, and it squishes it all together to a single color value. Well, this is the color we want to remove, so we're going to invert it by Option or Alt I, right? Change the blend mode to color, and then start reducing the opacity until we get some more natural colors back. There we go. And so that's pretty close to the correction that we did with the blue adjustment or the blue curve down here. And I'll tell you right now, I'm a little bit colorblind, so this is always a challenging thing for me to dial in. I have to use reference images in order to really get it correct. But there's still some blue in the background area, but we can adjust that selectively a little bit later on if we want. But very quickly, we've got some tools that use blend modes that let them do the heavy lifting for us, where we don't have to actually dial in too much. This is a very perceptual approach, and it allows you to be a little more flexible in your work. And even if you know good color correction techniques, sorry to keep playing with this, even if you know good color correction techniques using stacks of layers with selective color and hue and saturation or other tricks, adding something to your repertoire is important, because that flexibility will let you develop your own unique approaches down the road. So again, the theme is experiment and try not to get tied emotionally to whether or not you like the way something looks, or trying to prove that one technique is always superior to another. Clearly, there are going to be workflow advances, but I've seen a trend lately where someone might say, well, this one tool does the same thing as all these other 3 tools, so they should just be thrown away and you should never use those tools at all. That's not true. While you can do a lot of things with, say, curves, it helps to have some of these other approaches for whatever reason. Diversity of knowledge is always good, right? All right. Any questions on using these elements?
No, just Osvaldo says I already got my money's worth. So a lot of good education coming in for people. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Let's take a look at how we can use this with another image. Let's see if I can find her. Oh, I don't think I loaded it up. So give me just a second to get it out of
no problem.
Bridge. And
yeah,
we'll
just
take a common portrait example.
And just remind members of the groups, any questions, let us know in the comments underneath the live video. Any questions for Scott?
So speaking of contrast enhancement, one of the favorite techniques that you learn early on about blend modes is to duplicate and try things like this. So this is a little bit of an aside, but this is something that I think a lot of people maybe overlook anymore. Like I said, instead of just trying to use curves for contrast enhancement all the time, try starting with the blend modes. And the classic 4 that everyone wants to use are multiply to darken, screen to lighten, usually overlay, and soft light. And each one of these has its own characteristics. And I happen to like soft light for this one, but because of this blend mode, because of the way soft light actually behaves, you can go through and get some really interesting color casts by using the drop-down menu up here. So let's give her a little bit of a golder tone. Whoops, that's a little too much. All right, so you can do a little bit of grading work with this also. And the way those colors interact behave differently. So you have to be careful about using these curves, just like I noticed, just like we pointed out in, I thought I named these things well enough. There we go. I just didn't look far enough. When we saw earlier that different colors will have different effects as they blend together, the same thing happens when you go to a portrait. If I change this to overlay, now that gold is just insanely blown out. That's just way too much. So we could dial that back. But the thing to keep in mind is that the blend modes don't always have a linear response in how the color is transformed from one thing to another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, Michelle has a question, maybe something that you touched upon earlier, but could you please address fill versus opacity?
Oh, yeah. Let's look at that again.
Great.
Let's see. What's the classic way to do this is, I think, with an image here, right? So we have, let's just go back to this one. We'll reset the curve, make sure it's all the same. Yep, okay. So if we have this result of linear light, and we can stamp this to make it reference. So this is unchanged, okay? That's full value opacity and full value fill. We come down here and we set the opacity to say 40%, right? And we'll stamp that. And we'll say OP 40%. And then we'll swap that and set fill to 40%. Okay. So normally when you look at opacity and fill, there's an order of operations that you have to consider. For most situations with blend modes, opacity and fill are going to behave the same way. Like I said, there are 8 that are exceptions to this, and they're actually variations of the same thing. So if we look at, let's say, linear burn and linear dodge, those also behave differently with fill and opacity. And when you get down, those are individual blend modes that either darken or lighten. When you get down to these contrast blend modes is where you get some additional ones, such as vivid light and linear light, that happen to be composites of these blend modes. So where linear burn operates on the dark stuff and linear dodge is on the light stuff, it lightens things. Linear light splits that. Anything that's below 50% brightness gets burned, and anything above 50% gets lightened, dodged. That also happens to be the case in overlay, but overlay doesn't respond differently to fill and opacity. So the fact that linear burn and linear dodge both do tells you that the composite also has that. Okay. So when we look at opacity being 40%, and we turn that off, and we see linear light being at fill at 40%, you can see that they do behave differently. We preserve more of the contrast because the math is happening after the images are blended within the layer itself. And without breaking down the actual equations, it's kind of difficult to describe. But really what's happening is order of operations, and the compositing equation that sits underneath this, called the Porter-Duff equation, places the variable that controls opacity and fill in different locations in the blending formula. I don't know if that is what you were after, but that's the basic explanation. We can actually do a cool little experiment here that's probably a little more obvious. If I take, let's say, a linear gradient black to white that's smooth, right? And this is one of the other experiments you can run, is how to explore isolating different features, because Photoshop only thinks of your images in terms of these channels. So it's a bunch of gray levels that get put together, and it tries to compensate for human vision. And so it does some odd things with trying to compensate. Not everybody's vision is the same. And you can use these experiments to explore how that works. So here we have our spectral gradient over what I'm going to use as a luminosity variable. So I come down here to hard mix. You can see Photoshop is translating the combination of a color with a gray value, and you get in this hard-edged result. Okay. So hard mix responds differently between opacity and fill. So if we lower opacity, like I showed before, you're just seeing more of this gray gradient underneath, and it doesn't really look like it's blending. This is just becoming more transparent. But in this case, fill is actually a blend. So it's doing some mathematical function on the brightness values in each of the channel with the brightness of the gray levels here on this one. So if I lower fill, look at that. That's a pretty dramatic difference between the two, right? And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to go exploring opacity versus fill, is because this is dramatically different than coming up here to opacity and lowering that, right?
Right now you have Michelle stating that, thank you. She says, I just found the modes like hard mix look terrible as is, but changing fill made a huge difference for her.
Oh, good. This is, let's look at another example of that real quick, where you can use actually hard mix for a photograph. I'm going to add my curves adjustment. And because this is such low contrast, I'm going to go all the way to hard mix. And you look at that and you think, God, that is just horrible. If I lower the opacity on this like a normal person would, that's not really getting me anything. Hard mix must be a complete waste of time, right? Except now we can lower the fill value, and look at that. That's the same curves adjustment layer. I'm just using fill instead of opacity, and check that out. Right? And that's with the hard mix blending mode, something that most people throw away.
And then Thomas has a question for you.
Okay.
Says, you have already mentioned highlight, darken, and contrast. Any comments on how you would categorize the blend modes?
Sure. Yeah, I always miss that out because everybody who talks about blend modes talks about this categorization, and first I just block it from my memory, but it's really actually important. You can see these lines in between the sections, right? So we have normal and dissolve, and dissolve works on a random seed that applies as soon as you start Photoshop. So if you get a particular result, the classic example of using dissolve is to come up with kind of a grainy pseudo halftone effect. And it doesn't really work well here because it needs something different than an adjustment layer. But these are the normal blending modes that just deal with opacity. This first section of 5 all deal with darkening. So they literally take whatever pixel information is on the 2 layers and they result in something that's either the same or darker. Lighten is just the opposite, right? And they're ordered in such a way so that they're analogs. You have lighten and darken, which are opposites of each other, multiply and screen, color burn, color dodge, and so forth. So those all individually operate on a half, let's see, I don't want to say half. They operate in one direction of tonal value, either lighten or darken. These are composite blend modes that can push in either direction. And basically they split combinations of the other 2 sections for lighten and darken. Overlay, like I said, is multiply and screen. Soft light is similar, but with a little more complicated. It generates a curve rather than just a discontinuity between light and dark. Hard light is similar, again, with a little more contrast. Then we increase.
Scott?
Yes.
Are you clicking on the the menu for the layer blending modes? Because people are not seeing that menu kind of popping up.
Ah, yes, I forgot. The webinar software does not.
I mean, I can see the layers panel just fine, but
yeah. Okay, so let me go up here to. I'm on overlay right now, so you can see it in the menu here, right?
Yeah.
That up. All right. I apologize. I always forget about that too. So we'll use the shortcut you mentioned earlier. So I've got overlay going now.
Looks like you've got rid of layers panel altogether now.
Oh, it doesn't even. Wow. So it won't even show you floating panels.
Yeah, I just see channels pass, and then I see your curves above it, and then your tools on the left of that. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, it's all magic, right? So you're not meant to see any of that anyway.
That's right. That's right.
Let me put it right here so you can see it at the same time. And now Photoshop's being finicky about dropping the tool. There we go.
Okay, so now I see layers as its own separate.
Right. Okay. So in the drop-down menu, right up here in the blending area, I am. It's a pop-up that you can't see here clearly, so I'll just go through them. Okay. In any case, there are different categories of groupings here, and the one I'm talking about right now are composites. So you had the normal group at the top. You have a darken group, a lighten group. These are composite groups, the 4th one down, and they combine in some way the same formula that are happening in the darken and lighten. And when you get to hard mix, this is where it compresses everything into either CMYK or RGB, and you can see that effect in the channels. Right, so it's either black or white. That's all that happens with hard mix. The next section down are comparison modes. They are difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide. And they're not real exciting when you're looking at an adjustment layer right now. They're meant to actually do comparisons between layers. And I don't really have an experiment to show you right now that shows this off, but some of these are pretty cool. So for example, if I come here and set this to hard mix, lower my fill back to where I wanted it, then I can come and grab a solid color layer. Let's do this. And I'm going to change its blending mode to exclusion. And so now we have this cool kind of retro graphic look, right? And then we have difference, which gives you a little more contrast. And this is just, again, a solid color layer. I wasn't really planning to talk about effects, but these are actually kind of cool things to deal with, right? The math behind the scenes is just what you'd expect from the names. You have difference, which is literally the the absolute difference between the gray value on any channel of the lower layer and the gray channel of the upper layer that's being blended. All right. And finally, at the bottom, we have these utility layers that are split into hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. So if we start with hue, what it does is it takes the current value or the current layer and it blends it. It replaces the hue of what's below. So this image isn't very colorful. Let's look at this one. I've got her on hard mix. So let's reset that. I go down to hue. You can see that the gradient that is applied on the layer is now replacing the hue in the background layer. And this is where it becomes important to understand the distinction between hue and color. Color combines both hue and brightness, and in a lot of these areas, so you increase the brightness value of whatever's underneath. But it also means that if you have something that's a neutral color, the color blend mode actually applies. Look at well, let's go back here. I've got hue set, and it doesn't look like there's anything going on because this image is so desaturated. There's nothing to lock onto. If I go to color, now all of a sudden color applies because it's also looking at the brightness values that are in here. And for some reason, I think I'm saying that wrong, but I'm a little off track, so apologies. You can turn these things into utilities also. So if we go back to this young lady and we grab another solid color layer and we make it fully saturated like this, we can set it to saturation blending, and now we get an idea of how saturated some of these colors are. And that's helpful in retouching, because then you know if there are saturation problems that aren't necessarily easy to see without this highlighting or this helper layer. I feel like I'm kind of running off the rails there.
No, it's cool. Interesting. It's interesting for sure.
Well, I put together a whole agenda where I was going to go step by step, and I went off that after the first question. So we're just kind of freewheeling it right now.
So maybe what about jumping into what Thomas requested, which is not the categorizing, but where's his other comment? Here it is, about blending textures. Do you want to go over like blending some textures onto another photo?
Yeah, but you know what? Let me show you this one first. This is
Sure.
Actually the demo that I wanted to kind of convince people that you should be using blend modes for more than special effects. All right, so I'm gonna cheat and I'm apply a frequency separation from the Retouching toolkit. This just helps automate. Don't worry about the steps in this, because you can look up frequency separation lots of different ways. All right, so I'm going to choose this. Classically, when you do frequency separation as a way to do skin correction, and I'm not worried about colors so much at the moment, I'm just going to do some detail correction and balancing out some of these rough areas on her cheek. You have a low frequency and a high frequency, and the way these apply let you selectively manipulate different sizes of details and different kinds of information on your image. Don't worry about the details so much. I'm going to duplicate this low frequency copy first, and I'm going to turn it into a luminosity control layer. So I want to only work on the luminosity to even out some of this roughness on her skin. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a black and white adjustment layer. I have a preset for the black and white adjustment layer that is completely neutral. What that means is the perceptual brightness that Photoshop tries to show you when it translates a color into a brightness or a luminosity value on your screen is based on a different visual model than most screens are actually displaying in right now. So the default black and white conversion is not accurate in terms of luminance power, right? So this neutral value actually corrects for that. That means I have a true neutral luminosity value. I'm going to select both of these and Option E to combine them together, or Alt E. And then I'm going to set it to luminosity value or luminosity blending mode so that the luminosity of this channel replaces the luminosity of this channel. And ideally, you don't want to see any change, which is what happened here. I'll duplicate that again. And this one I can leave alone, but I'm going to change it to hue. Now, the hue of this, so I separated luminosity here and hue here, so I can operate on them differently. Let's look at hue first and grab the mixer brush to blend some pieces together. Oh, that would be plus. Okay. In this example, it's a little hard to see some of the hue differences, but the makeup doesn't quite exactly match her skin tone over here, so I would want to blend those. But just to make it more obvious what I'm doing, I'm going to start with a smaller brush size, and I'm just going to, this is going to look horrible, I'm going to pull down the hue from the lipstick here onto her skin just so you can see what happens. Okay, can you see that color change? Or that hue change, Andrew?
Yeah,
okay.
Underneath the lips, yeah.
Right. Okay, so what I've done there is pulled the hue down there, but you notice the brightness did not change. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. Push it back up in there and just ignore. We'll just call it sloppy technique because I didn't undo it. All right. So normally I would go through here with a fairly large brush, and I'm just making little scrubs to kind of even out the hue. All right. You shouldn't really see a whole lot right away, but what I'm actually doing is kind of smearing together the hue so that the variation is less dramatic. And when you do makeup retouching, this actually becomes quite a bit more important so that you get even coverage, which can sometimes be hard to see during application and even during when you're taking the shots, looking at the model, it's easy to miss some of these things. So that would be my first pass. Now, let's take a look at luminosity. So typically with frequency separation, you would go through and you'd manage these little details, such as this guy right here. Can you see the cursor? I'm not looking at this thing.
No, I don't see the cursor so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you shake it? If you're on a Mac, if you shake it, it gets bigger sometimes. But.
Well, I'll just do this. Let me grab a regular brush, and ooh, that's huge. Normally with frequency separation, you're worried about taking out these little details, right? You see where I've painted? You would correct those things. Yep. And you might go into the high frequency layer and even deal with some of this, or you'd use dodge and burn to smooth out this transition. And those are all excellent techniques, but you can do a lot with this, with the mixer brush and this luminosity value. So I'm going to go back to my luminosity layer. Let me name it so it's more obvious. Grab the mixer brush, and now probably zoom out, would be easier to see the change. I'm just going to start doing the same thing. I'm scrubbing in little circles to kind of blend those variations. Now I'm not changing the detail at all. And if I tried to do this with a dodge and burn layer, I would have to get in with a brush roughly the same size as these little pixels. Right? So anything that's in those little areas, if I want to dodge and burn that away, I would have to go in very carefully and stick to exactly the size of the feature that I want to correct. But using this luminosity value, luminosity layer, I can even resculpt some of her face a bit, and the result tends to look a little more natural. Right? So let's just apply a little bit there. And I'm being a little heavy-handed here so the results are more obvious. But there's nothing to say that you have to. All right. Are you still there, Andrew? My computer just hung up on me.
Yeah, I'm fine. Just
okay.
taking it in.
Just didn't want this to drop the connection. There we go.
No, it looks good. Looks good. Okay.
So now when I zoom out and do the before and after luminosity, you can see in just a couple of seconds I was able to smooth a lot of that out and get rid of that roughness without having to go in and do any detail correction. So that's a very high level approach that works very quickly. You can also smooth out highlights this way. So if you have something that's a little too hot and specular, you can smooth it. You can take care of odd shadows, right? So if you were doing this again with dodge and burn layers, you'd have to be very, very careful about the scale, but I'm using the same size brush and I'm just smushing the luminosity values together, right? So again, here's after, that's where we started, right? And that's because I was able to isolate just the luminosity by converting it to a grayscale, getting rid of the color information, and using the luminosity blend mode so that I don't affect other features of the color elements that Photoshop thinks it wants or thinks you want to see, like saturation and brightness. All right. As I'm setting up the next one, are there any other questions on how that works or why I like this method?
No new questions, but just a reminder, please do type in your questions underneath the live video. Let us know if you have any questions now.
All right. Have I hope I haven't lost anybody on this. Like I said, I wanted to kind of show the utility approach to the blending modes more than the creative stuff.
No, I think it's interesting.
Okay.
But I am curious myself, though, to see some of the blending with textures as well, though. Yeah.
Okay. Tell you what, look, if you have anything that you want to chat about, let me go ahead and set up my next document. And I will. I guess I can keep talking while I look, because that's always entertaining when somebody's.
Yeah, I'll let you know if there's any new questions. Yeah. So.
Okay, let's get some. I have to go through my demos now. All right. I think this will work. Okay. So to textures, this is what everybody wants to use blend modes for, and this is actually one of the most common approaches to the tools, is to allow different elements of two images to come together. And I'll show you two versions of this, which I think are actually kind of cool. So this is a classical texture application, right? I've got a blend mode here applied of multiply. And if I go back to normal, you can see things don't really look very believable. It just stuck on top like this rust layer was cut out and stuck over her face as a flat panel. If we go to multiply, now what's happening is the darker areas on her face, these shaded regions, now impact and give some depth to this flat texture. So now it looks more like it's wrapped around. In this particular case, I've also used these blend if, and a blend if is a selective way to allow lighter or darker values to blend between layers, so that you can it's easy to describe it as being transparent, but that's not exactly what's going on. It is an actual blend. So as I change the darker and lighter sliders, you can see that it has different amounts of blend. So this is another way to compare pixels on two layers, right? So this is kind of a classic approach. We can look at some of the other different blending modes. And I just noticed somebody had pointed out that I should probably be sharing the screen, not the application itself, because these modal windows just aren't showing up.
Yeah, that was way back. That was
yeah,
like 20 minutes ago.
So let me share.
I'm not sure if that means you'd have to go back and into the share function and then choose desktop one instead of the application Photoshop.
Yeah, let me stop the screen and I'll share it again.
Okay.
We'll try share screen, and I think is it screen one? Yep, there we go. Okay, so maybe now you can see the modal images. I apologize for that.
Not at all. It's back up. Looks good.
There we go. Now we can see the cursor and everything. Wow. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I always choose desktop one just as a kind of default.
The notes. Yeah. Okay. So I've opened up the advanced layer or the layer style dialog, and down in the advanced blending, these blend if sliders let you be a little more selective in the values, and you can actually choose the color channels for blending also, if that is something that's a major component in the items that you're working with. Okay. So the purpose of all these different controls is to let you achieve more or less realism, or to realize the artistic goal that you have in mind. But we don't have to stick just with multiply. We can check out some of these other techniques, or some of these other blends also. They give us some different results. So when you go to blend textures, it's always a good idea to experiment with a few different blending modes to see what you like. This one obviously makes things darker. If we go down to Dodge, we're going to blow things out, and now she looks more like a burned White Walker from Game of Thrones, right? It's
yeah,
odd. But again, linear dodge is something. Let's do something a little prettier. Linear burn behaves differently with fill and opacity. So if I lower the opacity, you're just seeing her skin show through, and that's okay. That looks more like a tattoo. This is, you'd use opacity here to kind of feather the blending, or the blended result, so it looks more natural on the skin. But if you want something that has a little more crunch to it, you could do the fill opacity, and you retain a lot of that saturation. And now it looks a little more more like a realistic texture that's actually coming out of her skin in that case.
And I have a question. I tend to use overlay a lot when I want to do this type of effect. How would you describe overlay works with the layer underneath?
Well, like I said, overlay is a combination of multiply and screen. So anything that's dark on the current layer will make everything on the lower layer even darker, and anything that's light will make it lighter. So it's again very similar to splitting the tonal values and applying two different mathematical formulas to them. You know, if it's dark, it gets darker. If it's light, it gets lighter.
All right, great.
And so we can also come down here. Here's another one for hard mix. Again, hard mix looks absolutely horrible there, but if we lower,
it's interesting that the preview is just showing like the left and middle section.
Oh, it's not redrawing.
Yeah, it's not redrawing the whole, you know, her face and her neck and a bit of her chest. It's just showing that one section. It's still a good preview, but it's sort of like a cutout. It's interesting.
It is bizarre.
You have to zoom in and zoom out. I don't know.
Yeah,
sometimes that works.
No, okay, there's a redraw issue.
Yeah, it's getting a little funky now. Should have shut my mouth.
Yeah, no, it happens. It just, look, and it's doing it across.
Oh, now it's showing.
Yeah,
now it's showing
awesome.
like that graph before. And
oh, and Photoshop just crashed on me.
so now, yeah, now your video's in the middle. Weird.
Yeah, let me stop this for a second.
That was a bad suggestion. Sorry.
Yeah, well, you know, it happens. It's always
like zoom in, zoom out, and like the whole world crashes.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's okay. So now I'm getting the error report. We'll send that. Thank you.
Photoshop crashes? I didn't think it ever crashed.
No, that's heresy. Can't you see? Yes, okay, yes. Yeah, it did crash. Yeah, okay, call in the nuclear codes. All right, bye. Here we go. Now it's going to try and open up all the. Yep, here we go.
Andrea's here. She says, "Oh, the fun of streaming online."
Wow. All righty. Yeah, and it even closed the documents I was working on. So, how fun.
Well, you're right at the top of the hour, you know.
Well, good. You know, maybe it's union. It needed.
It's a sign.
Hard stop.
Osvaldo says, "Whoa, a telephone. Haven't seen that in a while."
Yeah, you like that? This is my.
It's your little like bat phone, right?
Yeah, that's my direct line to Adobe support, and you can tell it's pretty worn out. Oh, I didn't say that out loud. If there's me. I'm sorry, Jeff.
Hey, where can we get one of those?
Yeah.
Direct line.
Yeah.
So, any questions?
You notice the direct line isn't actually plugged in anywhere, so it's gonna.
Yeah.
That's about as effective as it is.
It's your Halloween part of your Halloween costume. Yes,
I go as a bad pixel.
Good to see Andrea here. She says, "Been there, Scott." Yeah.
It happens.
She says, "Does that phone really work?" Come on.
It does actually. It plugs in. Well, this particular, I have another one that plugs into the bottom of my phone, so I can actually make a call. And I think some of you might have been around at Photoshop World a couple of years ago when I was walking around with my phone and the that handset
That's
doing
funny.
kind of a James Bond thing, or more like Get Smart, not James Bond. All right.
It's good to see you all. Yeah. You just missed
So
what? The old phone feel? That's why you connected to your iPhone or Android?
it's just fun. It's a
Yeah,
conversation. I'm
sure.
socially awkward, and you can tell I don't have anything fun to say, so that's why I have to have these little diversions. You know, I've got on my desk, I've got little, you know, if this is going to focus.
Is that a Homer? Homer's? No, it's the
It's the scientist. I can't remember his
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I've got tons of junk all over my. Anyway, so where I wanted to go with this is that blend modes are frequently used creatively, but they're not just something that you should throw away or use only for creative effects. They're great for that, but you can also use them in a utilitarian way. You can isolate hue and saturation. You can isolate luminosity. You can use them to help visualize certain things in your retouching workflow that may not otherwise be visible. I do another presentation on helper layers that is entirely dedicated to bringing out details that you can't normally see and separating things so that you can focus on particular areas in your retouching. And some of those use blend modes and some not. But the idea is that blend modes really are math. And if you understand what's going on behind the scenes, at least at a high level, at a conceptual level, you can exploit that math to do a lot of work for you, whether it's increasing contrast, whether it's isolating hue and luminosity, you know, or applying textures in a little more advanced way, knowing that you're making comparisons between layers and you're taking whatever's on the bottom of the layer and applying a mathematical function to it. When you change a blend mode, you're getting new stuff out, and that new stuff doesn't just have to be pretty. It can really be helpful.
Excellent. Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, it's good to break it down that way and see it that way. You know, a lot of times people just show how they use blend modes in their workflow, but they don't really break it down to how they really work. So nice to see. Thank you. And
yeah, and again, the other thing to do is experiment. Make your gradient files as simple as possible. I'm sorry, your experiment files as simple as possible. You can use any kinds of gradients. I tend to like to use black to white, and then I posterize it so that I can see the individual steps. And that really helps understand a lot too. The more you do it, the more familiar it becomes and the more it sticks in your brain. Right. And what you want to do, like I said, is you want to get your tools out of the way of your art. And the way to do that is familiarity and intuition.
Cool. Nice.
Good.
I will, yeah. Andrea says blend modes are amazing. I thought I was already a whiz at them, but you took them to another magical mathematics level.
I have not yet begun to nerd. I have some stuff. Let me share one screen. I know we're running close on time here, but I want to share this one thing.
Thomas says, thank you. It is always inspirational to see your blend mode magic. Your books are some of the most useful Photoshop training I own. That's nice. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And Facebook user, sorry, it doesn't give your name, says, thank you so much. I learned a couple of great new techniques. Really appreciate your technical perspective on blend modes.
Thanks.
And love following it. Yep.
So before everybody goes, let me show this one little thing, and I'm gonna do it the way I did before because you don't need to see the tool. I'll just share the application. Okay, so when we start to get nerdy with this kind of stuff, right? You can do these kinds of things where I've got these are just, whoops, where'd it go?
Andrea says, whoa, once you actually nerd, watch out.
Oh, it's a blast. Okay, so I have these basic bars right here, right? So these are just solid color bars. There's no other trickery involved. I add a luminosity conversion, right, which is just a black to white gradient set to luminosity blend mode. And you can see right away that the brightness doesn't look exactly uniform, right? So the blue obviously has, Photoshop thinks it's darker than, say, this yellow. Now, if I go up here and add a saturation mask, what this tells you, see these white bars that happen? That is the level where saturation peaks for that particular color. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, so and this may be a little esoteric, but the point of this visualization is that not only do the colors have different brightness values in terms of how the computer wants to present them to you, the saturation peaks at different values. So if you have, let me draw on the layer up here. There we go. Let me get a little color. We'll make the size smaller. So when I work, this is one of the cheats that I use, is understanding where these different peaks are. And I can go make reference files. So when I do a color correction where color actually matters, I can compare based on these values, knowing that the yellow bar, which is this one here in the center, this is yellow. If I turn off the saturation mask, right? It peaks at a much higher luminosity value than blue, which is down here, right? So they have different impact on your vision, and they will reach saturation at different luminosity values. Now, we could get into the math in that at some point in the future, but this little simple setup that I kind of devised here helped me visualize exactly what the tools are doing. And the reason I did this was so that I can come in with, say, the vibrance tool. And if I adjust the slider on the vibrance tool, I can see in an unambiguous way what impact it has on the individual colors, right? So now I know what vibrance does because I can see in real time what it's doing to the colors individually and why it might be different than a hue and saturation adjustment layer. So I nerded.
Nice.
There we go.
Cool.
Okay. So I took a little extra time there. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's fine. So yeah, any more questions? Any last questions? No. Well, I thought it was very informative. Yes. Don't forget
I have to plug
Scott's
the book.
book, The Hidden Power of Adobe Photoshop, Mastering Blend Modes and Adjustment Layers for Photography, on Amazon. And
Yep.
I can also, if you want a link, you can always contact me or Scott, and we'll gladly send you a link to purchase that book.
And a lot of the stuff that I talked about today is scattered throughout the book. So there's a lot of discussion on experiments, a little bit on color theory, and a lot on the utility of combining blend modes with other tools so that you can really speed up your workflow and get a lot of power.
Excellent.
Cool.
Can they? Osvaldo says, "Can we get an autographed copy?"
Find me on Facebook and we'll try and work it out. It's pretty expensive to send them overseas, but if you're within the U.S., I think I can probably cover that cost for a number of people.
Yeah, he's in Los Angeles, like myself.
Okay, yeah, then that would be a lot easier to deal with. I've had requests from Ireland and Israel and a couple of, and it gets pricey. It gets expensive to send out.
And Andreas is about to order that book. Need a link. So yeah, just contact me or Scott. We'll let you know.
All right.
And wanted to give a nice shout out to Scott as well. So I guess I'll put up the link and you can say what the content is, what you focus on. So on your site itself, skoksel.com, that is for what do you show there?
That's a blog that I use to kind of talk about a little bit of extra information for my monthly article in Photoshop User Magazine.
Right.
But I'm also starting to put up more editorial kind of stuff. So what does it mean to retouch an image in an age where we want transparency and honesty? Those are some topics that I'll be talking about soon too.
Nice. And then you can find Scott on Instagram as well. Instagram.com/the Scott Valentine.
Yeah.
I always like when people put that
Well, there's a few of us, right? There's Scott Valentine, the actor. There's a hockey player. Right. There's a lawyer in New York.
Right.
Yep. So there's a few.
But you're the Scott Valentine.
Yeah,
so
because I thought PS Scott Valentine was kind of weird.
Right. And then we have on behance.net, Scott Valentine.
Which I always forget about, but I will try and be better about updating.
I know. I need to spend a few days to a week to update. So
yeah, it's tough. There's lots of places.
Great. So Osvaldo says he lives in my backyard. If I had a backyard.
Yard also, you could.
I don't have a backyard. Okay,
Oh.
we have a front yard to my apartment complex. So Michelle says, thank you so much. And Osvaldo, thank you. Great info. Appreciate your time. Yes. And thank you, Osvaldo. Osvaldo's a moderator for the groups, so he's very helpful.
Thank you.
And so thank you so much, Scott. It was great and always informative. You big nerd, you.
That's a great compliment.
Great. Yeah, it's great. Yep. Thanks. And as usual, I will be sharing the link to the recording in the various groups afterwards. And I will also share the recording to Scott if he wants to upload to his blog or YouTube channel. So Perfect. Yes, thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a wonderful weekend. Linda says, thank you. Good info. So
thank you. And like I said earlier, if you have any other questions, get in touch with me on Facebook is probably the easiest way to get there.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending.